Hello, welcome back to The Word Above All. I'm Brian Anderson. We're looking today at Romans 11, verses 16 to 24. So let's go ahead and read the text and jump right in. Paul writes, "If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree?" Okay, what is going on here? Paul has shown in the book of Romans that God is going to save the full number of Israelites, and he's going to do that through jealousy. He's going to make the Israelites jealous by saving the Gentiles. And now he's going to go on to illustrate God's plan by using the figure of an olive tree. So what does this olive tree represent? It represents God's covenant people. There's one tree in this illustration, and that one tree represents all of God's true people. So the portion of Israel that didn't believe in Christ in this olive tree illustration has been lopped off, and the Gentiles who did believe in Christ have been grafted in. Now, if you take a look at this, nothing is really substantially new in this illustration, because even in the Old Testament, the people of God consisted of saved Jews and Gentiles. It just so happens that in the Old Testament, the Jews vastly outnumbered the Gentiles. And in the New Testament, the Gentiles vastly outnumber the Jews. But it's the same tree, made up of God's people, Jews and Gentiles, throughout redemptive history. And it's also important, I think, to remember Paul's not talking about individuals per se in this illustration. He's talking about groups. Israel as one group, the Gentile nations as another group. God hardened Israel. That's what he's told us earlier in this whole section. Israel was hardened, and that brought room for God to bring in the Gentiles. Now, if in the future Israel comes to faith, God's going to graft them back in. And if in the future Gentiles do not have faith but are unbelievers, they're going to be removed from this tree. So one of Paul's main points in this section is that the Gentiles should not be arrogant. He says that over and over. He brings up in verse 18, verse 20, verse 25, he says things like, do not be arrogant, or do not be conceited, or do not be wise in your own estimation. Evidently, these Christians had become puffed up and were thinking that they were somehow better than their Jewish brethren. Perhaps they thought that the Jewish brethren were worse than them because it was them that had crucified Jesus Christ. And so perhaps they were becoming a bit cocky and proud and conceited. Now, what's the point in all of this for us? I think the point is pretty simple. God is sovereign. God is free. God exercises both his kindness and his severity. He's kind towards believers. He's severe toward unbelievers. And we ought never presume on God's kindness. We ought never take it for granted. We need to appreciate God's kindness and show our appreciation by continuing in his kindness. Remember one of the last verses of the book of Jude? It says, keep yourself in the love of God. That's the idea here. We need to keep ourselves in the love of God. We need to continue in God's kindness. And the true believer will do that. So, until next time, may God bless you.